What I want to do is go through the process of visual abuse graphically and step by step. So we have the relationship between the child and the parent. And then we have the world environment out here. Now, the parent's role is to buffer the child from the excessive force and weight of the world, which is actually much bigger, but also of the energy between adults, because the child is capable of processing these patterns at a young age, at about 20 to 40% of the intensity that the adult can process. So the primary role of the adult is protection against unregulated, unattuned energy at a higher amplitude than the child can process. Now, when the parent fails to do this by their lack of presence, a lot of time, the presence of a parent is incredibly important. And when they are not present and the world funnels its amplified energy at the child, particularly the culture. Let's say this is a young girl who kisses another young girl on the cheek. And 40% of the country's culture has a charge about that, a meaning about that this little girl has no relationship with. And it is the parent's job to protect the child from that exposure. But when the parent does not do that, the child will feel shame. The child, if it feels shame at a certain intensity, will activate their traumatic function. And once activated, and if not repaired, a certain part of the child that is unable to cope with that intensity will dissociate and go into an unconscious orbit up in this area, and is now lost to consciousness. Now, having been lost, this child is closer to it is in a dissociated state, but its greatest shame and terror is now in a sociopathic condition. Because when you sever the connection consciously to your deep pains, you become unable to empathize with another person in their deep pains. So this is how the wound is created. In a destructive and hostile environment, the child is not protected by the parent's field. The child is hit with the full weight of the cult culture's media biases, which are often manipulated to sell advertising. The Rocky Mountain Media nonprofit did studies to observe that the most expensive advertising spot in the news or any other thing comes right after an intense adrenal burst of shame, violence, terror, something that pumps up the adrenal. So what the program does is it pumps up the adrenals, and then it follows this by an advertisement. And an advertisement and an advertiser, a company, will pay significantly more to have their ad placed right next to the most violent, extreme aspect of the program. And because of this, this actually shapes, because advertisers pay for most media, this actually drives media companies to artificially locate and amplify the most violent and adrenaline-producing aspects of reality and target them to their viewers so as to be able to be more attractive. Because the brain, once it goes into traumatic mode, wants to come down and will associate its come down. So you have violent bloodshot, car accident, go up, and then you have nice, smooth, soft skin lady selling soap. The soft appearance, her soft voice, the feminine, is medicinal to the traumatized viewer who has just been systematically traumatized for the benefit of that advertiser. And the product associated with it, using the memory technique of emotion and association, is now linked with the come down, which means that in a systematically stressful modern life, people will feel better when they're shopping in stress and all that, reaching for the soap that was connected with the soothing energy that soothed their trauma before. And this is how people are manipulated into buying things that they don't need and don't really want without their awareness. But the real victim is this child who is left by a modern culture to be exposed to TV, video games, and media. All companies that are not being paid to protect the child, but are being paid to sell the most product by the only people they are really working for, which is their advertisers. They're working on their viewers' brains, but they're working for the pockets of their advertisers. So this is the induction of trauma and abuse. And as the most sensitive parts of each child are first dissociated and then severed, the child becomes numb. It cannot feel the most tender parts of itself, which do not want to be present in the environment because they would get overloaded and overwhelmed with emotion. And so there's a numbness. And and this is where the healer's role in the shamanic sense comes in. Because the healer's role is to take a supportive and grounded stand for the psychologically young child to reclaim the most sensitive parts of themselves that were disconnected, to restore these severed switches and be flooded again with emotion. Because these dissociated parts are 2 years old, 3 years old, 6 years old. They haven't had the chance to develop like the rest of the self. And the child must trust the therapist and healer to do what their parents could not do, which was actually hold a space for these energies to reintegrate in the body, and the child to leave the sociopathic state of the reptilian brain and re-enter the predominantly human empathic parts of the brain with empathy. Now, as each of these charges come in, there will be an overwhelming sense of energy. It will push the boundaries of the psychologically young part of the self. And it will have echoes of the terrifying memories at the point which these parts of self dissociated. And the role of the therapist at those moments is to hold space and to let the traumatized individual feel that they can let go completely and absorb these energies one after the other, because the therapist, the healer, has their back. Now, this can take 3 days. This can take an hour. This can have a schedule of integration every 2 weeks. Every couple of hours. It can be erratic. But the key is that as each of these parts of the dissociated and thus sociopathic self return, that they are welcomed, that they are prepared for, that the disorientation and confusion that will occur is held in a safe space. Otherwise, they will rebound and dissociate again in a state of betrayal and confusion, or they will not come in to begin with. This is why having control, clear expectations, but most of all, the assessment of the healer and the client, the healer and the patient, on what is there and what is needed for it to come back in is absolutely vital. Much like a physical birth, which takes roughly 9 months, and which has a labor process that takes as long as it takes, the rebirth and reintegration process of traumatized and dissociated selves happens on its timetable, not the healer's. It is the ethical, moral responsibility of the healer and the patient to find and attune to what is initiated and wants to be born, what is invited to reintegrate. And this is important to understand because it provides insight to the first process or the first opportunity for betrayal that a patient feels. When a process is begun with one of these unintegrated parts, one of these dissociated parts, and it's coming back into the space, and the therapist falls away because it's part of the it's when the therapist falls away because the session is up and the patient is left alone in that state without being grounded, but with a clear message that the therapist wants to hear, that they're okay. That when the patient is not even fully educated about what is going on, and the fact that it is as real in terms of physics on an emotional level as the physical body is in terms of physics on a physical level. And that you can actually invite a part in and have it rebound out farther due to a lack of attunement on the part of the practitioner, who then asks the patient to please them by fitting into the box that the practitioner provides that is not large enough to hold this energy here and this energy here. So this actually divides the self when given a choice like that by a quote healer. So on the one hand, the participant has the choice to honor the wound. That's why they're there, and upset the healer. On the other hand, the participant and patient has the chance to please the healer, who is actually the abuser in disguise. because this is the same reenactment of the parent wound. When the parent, frustrated and flustered, gets a hot date, and the child already abandoned by one parent looks beseechingly at their parent, and their parent chooses not to see the look, chooses not to see the truth, and instead asks the child to lie and says, "You don't mind, do you?" And then, in case the child might actually tell the truth and say, "I feel absolutely devastated, and I feel so lonely, I'm going to sit here and eat and veg out because I don't want to admit that not only my father, but my mother does not care enough about me to see the truth or to respond to me." Hurries on and says, "Thank you so much. I'm sure you will have a wonderful time. I'm sure you'll have a wonderful time watching the media. Your corporations have carefully constructed to zone you out. And maybe even you'll come to think that being numb and sending more of yourself out into a dissociated space isn't so bad, because then you're not stuck here in a world where everyone lies to you and punishes and blames you if you tell the truth." Now, what happens when the therapist and healer collapses and walks away when a really big wound is coming in? The energy comes in, it hits the small psyche, and it causes them to lean on what is the purpose of the protective container, energetically and otherwise, to lean. And the healer stands, and there's a relief, and more comes in. But then the healer leaves and starts to fall away. The patient falls with the healer. They cannot take the intensity. Now, this is particularly the case when a new trauma or a psychedelic is involved, because in both cases, it's out of the client's control to regulate the intensity of what's coming in. And so you have a situation where there's a very large energy that's traveling relatively rapidly at the invitation of the patient and the healer. The healer is giving way. The patient is falling down. This energy feels like an enormous weight on the chest, on the psyche. It feels overwhelming, but it's not yet defined and understood. which is terrifying. When the healer walks away at this point in one form or another, they may walk away in inadequacy if they realize they don't know what's going on. They may walk away in hate at the inadequacy, that the client has drawn out their inadequacy. They may walk away in a lie that goes something like this, that says, I want my patient to feel like I'm totally there, so I'm not going to tell them that I'm not giving them any attention or presence at all. I'm going to say, I'll always be there for you. But really, I'm just giving a very cursory glance here. Well, now, when this body falls through this very sloppy energetic field and collapses, then there is a sense of shock, of hurt. But there is also confusion, because the healer said, I'm right here with you, but they're not there at all. And when the child has been trained by the cult and their parent to lie, to please the parent, the therapeutic patient is standing ready to betray themselves in order to protect their therapists. That's the new parental role. The parent collapsed also and wasn't there, which is why these parts came out into a dissociated state to begin with. And now that it's coming back and the person is collapsing again, the therapist, healer, is not standing there. And most healers want to feel that they are doing good, that their good is good enough, that they are being ethical, and that their patient appreciates them. But unlike the physical body, where this is absolutely impossible to lie about, except in chronic pain situations where we are also trained to lie and say, we're doing fine, for the benefit of everyone else who enjoys the positivity of our lies. In the emotional terrain, where both healer and participant are largely dissociated from many of their emotional truths, it becomes incredibly easy in a cult of betrayal and lies for the therapist to say, you're happy, aren't you? This is working well. And the patient to say, yeah, it's great. And yet actually be falling apart. And in the worst case situation, the therapist, seeing that they are not actually helping the situation, will withdraw so as not to be around when the patient has a traumatic meltdown, which is simply the overheating of their system, as new energy promised to be held and contained by the therapeutic container is coming in faster than it can be integrated. And what they're getting is the message that their lies are needed more than their truths, because the therapist, quote, healer, has lies of their own. And as a result, the client is actually paying money to enable the abuser, rather than the abuser being willing to sacrifice their own shadow, illusion, lie agendas in order to face the terrifying reality that they do not know how to heal their patient, that they don't know what to do, that they are afraid of doing it wrong, that they do it wrong many times, that they are afraid of being judged, that it is scary to betray someone, that the culture's norms of how you treat a patient are not always friendly, humane, or appropriate to a healthy client, but that the therapist will follow the protocol of their cult, the protocol of the template given to them in their training, over the well-being of their client, or will abandon that protocol when it conflicts with an agenda of their own. Now, the innocent child who is betrayed and in touch with their feelings first feels the blood, the tingle of blood of the wound, the emotional wound of being violated, being abandoned, being lied to by their practitioner, their healer, and of being left alone to birth what is invited in. This will turn into sadness and grief at that loneliness, the loneliness of betrayal, which, if unanswered, it may be blocked in order to please the therapist, particularly in situations of romantic attachment. They may protect the therapist, but if turned inward, this will become self-hate, despair, and helplessness. On the inside, which in some way will be communicated to the therapist, the healer. If that is not responded to, and most particularly if it is bounced back with a mirror dynamic, it's your fault. It's not me, it's you. This will turn into a loathing, a confusion, a hate towards the therapist, often passive-aggressively. A rage. It may become violent because the blood that began oozing out is a violation. There is a connection between the violation of our deepest hearts and the violation of our own and others' bodies, as we see in people that prefer when the emotional pain of being cut and raped emotionally is not honored by a cult that discounts and denies emotions. We have the phenomena of the abuse survivor that takes a knife to their arm and cuts their own skin to reveal the wound that this cult will not honor unless it has physical form. And there is an emotional satisfaction in both the control, in both the healing of loneliness on one level, and in the refusal to cooperate with the lie that the emotional wound doesn't matter. The frightened abuser will punish and try and shame the cutter into not doing it. Not because they are primarily focused on the well-being of the cutter, but because the cutting is in a certain way speaking in a way that regardless of what the cutter says, the abuser knows that with every scar and every bit of blood that the cutter sheds, they are speaking about a wound that the abuser gave and has bribed the cutter into silence about on a verbal level. And sometimes the cutter will continue the lie, continuing to own the shame. The abuser will look the other way, but know that their daughter, that their patient is cutting. Which means that the container provided by the healer and the parent is not adequate to take the load off of the psyche, a load that never belonged to them, a load that was inappropriately dumped when the parent and subsequent authorities did not protect the child from the unregulated violation of energy, largely from the cult of whatever culture happens to be around, that does not have the attunement or the best interest of that child as its primary agenda, but a variety of other complicated programs. When the abuser walks away, busyness, lies, blame, criticism, lack of attention, when the abuser walks away, and the anger and the loneliness and the hurt that emerges goes unanswered and unhonored, it can become unbearable. New parts can dissociate. The patient can start violently hurting themselves so as to protect their abuser. The patient can start behaving erratically. And one of the most loyal aspects that in the inner conflict between the part of the abuse survivor that depends on the world and the abuser and the parent, and thus does not want to confront them head on, knowing that they are the one who will be killed socially, mentally, emotionally, physically. They are the one who will be killed with hate, with denial, with lies, that the abuse survivor will speak the truth if they cannot hold it back, but do it in such a socially unacceptable way in the cult that the evidence presented is deemed inadmissible by the cult. For example, an abuse survivor in court will say, "This person hated me. I have felt miserable This person said this. Everyone saw it happen. I have been in absolute agony for the last 15 years. I have been tortured in the worst possible way. And the court will say, that doesn't matter. What matters is, did this person break a specific law? And do you have evidence in the format admissible in this court? And if not, none of your feelings and felt experience matters. Well, this court of law, rather than a court of balance or a court of emotion or a court of justice, this court of law is replicated within the community. If someone screams at a party, "You miserable bastard, you did this to me," the screamer has broken the law of the cult, which is that we mask all deep emotion at parties. This is a bigger transgression than whatever the person is screaming about within the cult, that is largely engaged in an activity of protecting social norms with little interest in defending and advocating for the truths of injustice against innocence, against the most vulnerable, if they, in this case, disrupt the party atmosphere. It is more likely that the person screaming, who cannot contain the lie anymore, will be escorted out of the party, will be actively avoided and thus punished for breaking the social taboo. Then it is that the whole party will, in a very healthy community, pivot and realize that if the environment is so sick that this amount of abuse, whether perceived, which is just as important, or actually enacted, that this speaks to a level of dis-ease and unbalance within the community and the group that deserves immediate attention. And the screaming will calm down because it does not need to scream in order to be heard. Because when that kind of pain is expressed, it needs the entire group to pivot, to honor it by knowing that this is our pain, that this is our world, that this is our community, and we have been raped also. And it is an honor to ourselves to take a stand for this human being. And it is not about shaming the abuser, who by definition has been abused. But it is not about protecting the abuse pattern either by glossing over it. It is about looking at the dis-ease and how we as a community have enabled the abuser and the abused by our refusal to look at the agony in our own hearts and minds, to advocate for those, to speak up against our abusers, the ways that we subtly betray so many who are desperately hanging on. And this is a chance for responsibility, for integration. The integration of those that we have pushed out at the edge of our circle. The abuser that feels terrified of being caught and either sociopathic because their wounds have been left in the dissociated state by their parents and healers and partners, or the victim of the abuse, the target, who expects in a sociopathic world to be punished for her outburst of abuse rather than understood, rather than it being implicit that for anyone to scream at a party suggests a wound that is so deep it will not fit in to the cracks the society has created to sweep it under the rug, but must be heard, and therefore needs to be heard, that the dishonor belongs to the community, that the woman had no other place to scream. The dishonor always belongs with the group. The dishonor always belongs with the parent. The dishonor always belongs with the healer, who, in a mixture of blind spots, lies, ignorance, deception, lack of training, and cult imbalance, rewards patterns that are inherently violent for all concerned. It's part of the picture, and it's important. It's an important part to understand.